Okay, so I am really excited about today's talk, as everybody should know. I have been passionate about wildlife since I was a little child. And to meet someone who is as well versed in wildlife and is doing such amazing things in the field of wildlife biology and conservation over these last few years, and he's from school, I mean, that is already a phenomenal achievement in itself, right? Not many people, I mean, from what we know of most people from school, they choose a lot of different directions, and wildlife is still a minority. We all have an interest in it, but the fact that he's working in it, in conservation, in the thick of things to change realities for the better on the ground is something that needs to be lauded. And I am really excited to talk to him about it today, having already attended one of his talks, and I was like, no, it was too short. So without further ado, I will ask Pranav. Uh, he was very junior to me in school, so I didn't know him. But I think we are all brought together by our interests rather than, our chronology of age or anything like that. So I will ask Pranav. Pranav, you have been in wildlife biology for quite a few years now. May I ask, what is it that got you started? Just a brief outlay of how you got into it and till where you are now.
Thanks for the question, Samir. And I'd just like to lead in with a word of appreciation for the DSOBS Executive Committee and to Kavita for bringing us together on this platform. And I share your sort of excitement and enthusiasm to be here today. So to get to your question quickly, I think like you, the spark, basically and deep and abiding interest in nature and the natural world is something that one grows up with. And at so many levels, I'm grateful to my family for having brought me up in places where I could be in nature, for taking me on hikes when I was only 4 years old, and helping me develop sort of this love and appreciation for the outdoors. And certainly my time at the Doon School helped me build on this foundation as I carried on my explorations of the Himalayas through school mountaineering expeditions, midterms, and so on. So those are the big names. And then by the time I was leaving school, or a few years before, I knew generally that I wanted to sort of have a career in this space, environmental science and wildlife conservation and so on. I didn't quite know what the path was. But I guess I made some decisions in terms of the courses I chose to study and so on, that by the time I was ready to enroll in a graduate program and a master's level program, I could specialize in wildlife science and wildlife biology. There are a few programs in India that enabled me to do that. I was lucky enough to find myself in one of these. And there was no looking back beyond that. I was trained and mentored by some incredible individuals at the Wildlife Institute, Dr. Gopal Rawat, for example, and others. And beyond that, I went on to pursue a PhD also in ecology. And again, had paid mentorship, in this case, Professor Barry Noon at Colorado State University, who continues to be sort of a guiding light in my sort of life and career. So that was sort of the formal part. But informally, as much as academic training offers, every minute that you spend in the wildlands, Samir, I know, this applies as much to you as it does to me, is you just learn from nature and through nature. You learn from people who are sort of walking this path, formally, informally. There could be people who are just, humble folks who are living around wildlife in little villages and hamlets and deep forests. There could be scientists. There could be, wildlife enthusiasts. There could be people from other walks of life who write about wildlife, who engage with literature or cinema, or it doesn't matter what. But at some level, we all sort of, there's so many people who have a shared interest and passion, and we all sort of learn and grow through our interactions. Samir, you're muted.
You're muted, Samir.
My mistake. Sorry. First
Pranav,
time.
Pranav, your audio needs to be clearer, please.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah, little closer to the mic. Can't hear
I
you.
would definitely say that, Pranav, based on how you managed to quickly summarize it, it's not that easy because so many people would have actually made such a big difference. And like you said, we all learn from people while walking the paths, and especially those we come across by chance, and it makes a massive difference. So let's get into the nitty-gritties of, the presentation, and especially the main part as to tigers, right? It is currently probably the world's favorite animal alongside the giant panda. And we all don't know why we love tigers, but we just do. But they always face a threat and a challenge. And that is no different even today. So, which is why I would ask you, just give us a understanding of the global status of tigers in terms of country comparisons as to why among all the countries, some countries have succeeded a little bit. India has succeeded and the current scenario quite a bit, and why others have fallen apart, even though their economies may be more powerful. So it's not as cut and dried as that.
Right, so that's a good question and a really hard one for me to answer in a nutshell. So if we look at the history of tigers over the last century, and certainly over the last 4 or 5 decades, it seems like the species was really down in a trough. Around the time of India's independence and so on, with the species, with the tigers potentially facing extinction in many parts of the range, including in India, where populations seem to be very precarious. Since then, from the evidence that we can piece together, it certainly is evident that tiger populations have bounced back in various regions of India. And likewise, if you look across the tigers range, and there's a map here that generally shows you where tigers occur on the planet today. What you're looking at, the dark orange areas, are only 7% of the species historic range in occur. So obviously, the species has gone through huge range contraction, as they put it. Why India has succeeded, where others have failed. I'll try and address that in a few ways right now, and hopefully over the course of the presentation, there'll be more clarity. But I think for one thing, for 5 decades now, there's been very significant government support at the highest sort of levels for tiger conservation in India. And I think not all other tiger bearing countries have had this level of support. I think the coming together of government support, civil society, and I think to a great extent, the culture of people who live in and around tiger habitats, their willingness to live with tigers has been a critical factor. Right. So I'm not going to speak to the tigers too much.
Yeah, sorry, no, I totally agree.
Now know that India's tiger populations are closer to 3,000 and so on, but it just shows you how the numbers stack up. Where about less than 30% of tiger habitats in the world today support 70-odd% of people. And I think that's really remarkable, given where India is at in its history. It's one of the world's most populous nations. It's a nation where there's immense pressure on all land, including forest land and tiger habitats. So if we can do it here, in a sense, we can do it anywhere. But it's a lot more complicated than that. So let's move through, and some of these aspects are gone out.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you just brought it up. We are the most populous nation in terms of density. There's no doubt about it. And the amount of pressure we put on forest land itself, we may think that, we have so much land available, but a lot of the main resources do come from forest land. And yet, as you put it, it's a combination of government support and definitely people's culture. that is allowed, tigers to keep thriving better than other nations around. So I would always bring back the thing that uh, why in certain cases have certain economies not been able to make the difference, where people have everything they need. They don't need to put any pressure on that. But is it just because of culture, or is it something more?
No, it's really the coming together of very many things. Right? And I think up front, we need to recognize that not all tiger habitats are very productive for the species. For example, we know that alluvial grasslands in areas like the Tarai, perhaps Kaziranga in the northeast, or even portions of central India, um, these areas are just packed with prey. These areas are really productive. You can sustain more tigers per unit area here than other parts of the planet where ungulates, wild ungulates, herbivores occur at much lower densities. For example, tropical forests. So obviously, there's very fundamental ecological differences among areas and sites, which sort of sets the carrying capacity or threshold of the number of tigers an area can sustain. But beyond that, it's how people interact with forests, right? And in some areas, for whatever reason, if these ungulates and herbivores are getting hunted out, either because of a lack of enforcement, because of a lack of political support and commitment for conservation, or just because of sort of an overbearing demand on game, whether it's for trade or whether it's for the evening meal. I think that really impacts the ability of tigers to persist. So if you're seeing these patterns of abundance and rarity, certainly in some combination, these factors are playing themselves out.
Yeah, no, this is a huge highlight in how, it's not just a single factor that makes a difference in how a species can go on. And I wanted to just put a segue on this and put global tiger status at 3890 versus tiger status around the globe as I would add maybe a 0 at the end of it, because there are more captive tigers in the US and China amidst farms and private farms that basically exist. I mean, the global tiger status that we're seeing now is a little misleading. So can we make a comparison that are we talking only about just tigers, or are we talking particularly about wild tigers?
Well, I think the conversation that really matters from a conservation standpoint is the conversation about wild tigers, because all these other tigers are effectively not able to contribute to populations or live out their lives in ways that tigers have evolved to live out their lives, which is in vast, complex landscapes, right? These species are confined to anything from, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 square foot apartment somewhere in some corner of the globe, or to tiny cages here and there. And for one reason or other, they've been captivated. At some levels, this is obviously, an atrocity on an animal like the tiger, which is sort of born and designed to live in vast areas. They have home ranges between 30 and 400 or 500 square kilometers, depending on and the location where in the planet the species occurs. So why are they in captivity, and whether they should be there, and how that might be ended in areas where it's just not ethically or morally or otherwise viable or supported, is sort of a much longer conversation. Maybe we want to go down that path now, or maybe we save that for a later moment in the talk or another occasion.
No, we can go down that path at any point. But before that, I think we want to give an insight into all our audience into what does a tiger have to go through in its life just to make it. I mean, forget about all the population pressures put by humans, all the global warming aspects and politics that plays into it. Just the life cycle, just a short summary. What does it have to go through to get to just adulthood and then stay there?
So I often argue that tigers live short and very violent lives, right? And short, most tigers, if lucky, will live about, as long as our beloved pet dogs live. Something in the range of 12 to 15 years is a respectable life for a tiger. There could obviously be exceptions where there's longer-lived animals, not by a long margin, but nonetheless. So, and in the course of the 15 years, they go through a lot, right? In the first 2 years of life, they just need to somehow survive. Hostility, both from conspecifics, that's from other tigers, potentially from other predators that may be hostile to tigers, from the elements, from humans, and then at 2 years of age, whether they're males or females, they disperse. They need to go and establish their own territories. And this is obviously a process that's fraught with many, many risks. So we know that, every two tigers that's born in a litter, one will survive to adulthood. And then beyond that, whether it will actually go on to live its life out to an age of 13 or 14 or 15. On an average, I think, possibly fewer than 40 or 50% of tigers that make it to adulthood will actually live their lives out. Obviously, this varies from context to context based on levels of protection and threats and the prey available to them and so on. And then in the course of their lives, they defend, maintain and defend territories, right? So females sort of hone in on resources, which is cover, water, and abundant prey, mostly deer, pigs, in some cases monkeys, and other species as well. And males are really centering their territories on females, trying to maintain territories with as many female territories within as possible. And the process of maintaining territories is complicated and certainly involves sort of intensive patrolling, as it were, by tigers day to day to mark out their territories and to defend these territories from other animals that are also looking to expand their own territories. So Samir, here's a nice picture of some tiger cubs. Can you tell us something about it? I think this is your image.
Yes, this was a picture taken by me in 2012. This is the three Telia sisters. It's 3 out of 4. I mean, there's a fourth one hidden in the grass. And this is when they were 6 months old. And in the area in Tadoba that they were growing up, it was very well protected. It had abundant prey. And their mother also had a personality where she was confident. And these all 4 cubs had a fantastic personality that they were also very confident. You would never see a 6-month-old tiger try to stalk gore, a fully adult bull gore or a bison, just for play. You would never see a fully grown, a 6-month-old cub, a bunch of cubs try and harass a sloth bear. I mean, they would literally have fun doing that. Of course, once they got to 2 years, they killed the same sloth bear and they ate him up in front of us. So that was a different thing, So if you're a sloth bear in that area, you are fair game. You should not, be around them. Because, but if there's one thing like you highlighted that, prey base makes a massive difference. You can see that some of them, their stomachs are a little fat. So they've eaten well. And because they've eaten well, their confidence is high because they know where they are. They know they are the ones who rule the roost here. They're given that security by their mother as well as the father who used to keep patrolling the area very well. And it had a lot of water. So the water did not go away at any point. So that's why I would say, and they grew up to 2 years and all 4 of them became independent, which is not easy in tiger cubs. I mean, I think as you would have seen, a lot of us have seen between 0 to 6 months, a lot of them die of gas, indigestion, they die of parasites. And then after that, between 2 and 5, the conflict with people. So this is, like you say, we are blessed in certain areas to have the kind of prey base and residence capacity to allow these tigers to thrive. So I would now go on to the next part as to we know that a lot of the valley areas are great for tigers. Is there any unusual area where you found tigers over the last few years?
So, Samir, I think you made a really important and interesting point when you said, the sort of prime real estate for tigers, areas that are just sort of stacked with herbivores that they can prey on. It's sort of, well protected habitat. There's water, there's cover. Now, there's only some small, relatively small fraction of India's tigers that will actually find themselves in such areas. And other tigers will have to make do with habitats that are sort of inferior, at least to our eyes, in one way or the other, or sometimes in many ways, right? In terms of unusual spaces where one might find tigers, we've increasingly started encountering tigers in farmlands, sometimes quite far away from forests. And we recognize that tigers are now potentially adapting to these habitats. These are man-made habitats, and at some levels, as grasslands have been replaced by agriculture, tigers are making farmlands, where there's sugarcane, in some cases wheat, home. The other is 2 years ago or so, we did some surveys in the remote Himalayas. We climbed up to a high temple in the Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary called Mad Maheshwar. And then we climbed a high ridge above it. We were just looking up straight at Chokamba, a massive, very majestic Himalayan peak. And there was no real expectation of finding a tiger there, though a team member who was on this expedition had heard something about the presence of a tiger there in the past and was convinced that it was worthwhile to sort of explore this area and set some camp. Remarkably, at almost 12,000 feet, among rhododendrons and the two of these massive peaks, this young tiger, seemingly young tiger, showed up on camera. So the fact is that they're in places we don't expect to see them. They live, in addition to violent and short lives, incredibly lives full of sort of sometimes of long journeys, and they're able to sort of traverse long distances and end up in spaces like these.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, and this is not an unusual thing that it has only come to our light now. Otherwise, I've been told that it has been happening over centuries, that tigers have been known to be breeding up in the high Himalayas, crossing the passes and breeding up in parts of the high Himalayas.
Right, yeah, and I think this is such an exciting area of work because obviously we know they're all over Bhutan. Similarly, they must have been all over the Indian Himalaya. The fact is that there haven't been comprehensive surveys. The fact also is that they've probably undergone severe declines in many parts of the Himalaya. Even from Jim Corbett's days, we know for certain that the areas where he sort of tracked and hunted some of his famous tigers in Kumaon and elsewhere, these areas may only have sporadic tiger presence or no tiger presence today. So we know that the Himalayas constitute tiger habitat. To what extent the species actually occupies this habitat today, what their population status is, and so on, remains largely unknown. There are some studies in Arunachal here and there, but I think this is on the for tiger conservation. We're just establishing good information and then thinking about what we can do to promote tigers in these areas.
Yeah, I mean, when you compare it to what we are usually used to, that is the tiger in the valleys like this one, and you're constantly tracking that, and then you compare it to an area where the prey density and distribution is so low that even leopards will struggle to survive. They have to work very hard to survive, considering their body mass is designed to take on such a wide variety of prey. And yet you're amazed as to the adaptability of such a big cat. I mean, it's unbelievable. And I'm hoping that,
especially when you think that the animal also it's persisted in the Russian Far East, where the climate is about as inhospitable as it can be or anywhere on the planet, and obviously angular densities are extremely low. So an extension of that, tigers have just formed really large territories A single animal ranges over 4, 5, 600 square kilometers, just trying to secure mates, find prey, and so on. And then we also find them in the deserts of India, in sort of semi-arid areas, just the threshold of India's large deserts in Rajasthan and so on, in areas where the temperature goes up to almost 50 degrees and so on. So they're obviously adaptable, both behaviorally and in the ability to withstand different temperatures, adapt to these diverse habitats. The mangrove tigers or Sundarbans, present sort of a phenomena of their own. And this image is one that's really enduring to me. It's from Kishanpur Wildlife Sanctuary in Uttar Pradesh. Right, that's my field team. We were doing some research there for my PhD many years ago, almost a decade ago now. And one of these folks in this image, he's all of 6 feet tall. And you can see how all of us are just dwarfed by this animal. That effort he would mark this, and he would be territory. Right, he would scratch it extensively. He would rub his face against it, sort of almost rubbing scent off. And then you'd see females sort of following suit, sniffing this tree extensively, and so on. And this is how tigers communicate in forests. They vocalize now and then, but they certainly leave chemical signals of various kinds: scrapes, cat urine, spray.
Yeah, so that basically throws off the fact that the tiger is a solitary, isolated animal. When we think of solitary, we think of someone who is completely, introverted in their space, does not look out into the outside world. But in this case, this is their social media. They constantly interact with one another across, throughout the day, throughout, each month. And one of the other things I'm going to ask you is that, is this tree near the road, near the safari track?
So it used to be. This tree doesn't stand anymore. I think, we laugh about it, we think the tiger brought it down. But, he'd literally hang off it. So 2 years, a year after this image was taken, the tree just collapsed.
Oh, but not because of the tiger. Yeah, that would be the most unusual wait for a tiger.
There's moments we'd arrive at this tree. It was a buller tree. So ficus, right, they have a white sort of sap. And we arrived and the sap would still be dripping from the incisions that the tiger's claw had made on this tree. So, and there was no sign of it other than just dripping sap. So that's how furtive they can be. It was certainly watching us from behind a bush or something, but we had no sense of its presence.
Yeah, no, because I have been into Kishanpur and I have come across at least 2-3 trees like this on the safari track, where you look up into the branch and onto the branches above you, and you can see the claw marks, and you wonder, okay, that was a pretty unusual place. Otherwise, you expect it only on the trunk that the tigers will claw and rub their scent off their face. So it's good to see that nostalgic aspect where when you don't see it, but then you actually get to see how it actually happened.
Yeah, and at that point, we were actually involved with the lives of, in a sense, we follow them, we recognize them all by their stripes, and we follow their lives and their fates. And it was really powerful to be able to do that, to sort of be privy to their lives. And there was certainly an attachment to all of these animals. Many of them have now moved on, given the lifespan of a tiger and the many threats they face.
So going on to the same thing that we've now compared high altitude versus the valleys, and you've highlighted that alluvial plains and valleys, Tarai, have, as well as central India, have some of the highest densities of tigers because of the prey and all. Can you just put a bit of light as to why certain regions in the country are thriving and certain adjacent areas also, they don't have to be very far from the thriving areas, are absolutely silent or they're really struggling? When you compare Madhya Pradesh to Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, or you compare all of the Northeast to Kaziranga and the rest of Assam. So yeah, it would be great to get an insight into why this skewed ratio has come about.
So Samir, again, a really good question and a really hard one. And if you ask me what I do at work, I'd say a disproportionate amount of my time is spent in answering questions like these. And, I imagine it as a many-layered puzzle, a really complex puzzle, of which we have some clues and some pieces, and there's many gaps. And if you ask me what those clues and pieces, there's so many, right? So let's try and say this is an ecological mystery, and we are detectives and we are out to sort of resolve this. Why does Site A have very high tiger densities or large tiger populations, and Site B sometimes only a few kilometers away or a few 50, 80 kilometers away? For example, Rajaji National Park and Corbett Tiger Reserve, difference in magnitude of, or even here, Pilipit Tiger Reserve and Dudhwa, Katanya Valley of Chanchani, there's almost a twofold difference in tiger densities. And so this is a good slide, right? So, how does one approach this question? We obviously know that food is really important. So can we quantify how much food there's for tigers? That's obviously primarily wild ungulates, wild herbivores, also potentially cattle that they prey on often. Now, it's one thing to be able to try and count deer in the forest. It's another to sort of do this scientifically and to get estimates that are spatially explicit, which is the case here. Right, so the map that you see in the background here, the shades that go green through red. Greens are areas with very low densities of ungulates, of deer. Areas of red have higher densities of ungulates, and you see a little scale here. This is ungulates per 500 square meters or per 0.5 square kilometers. That was the unit here, roughly. And you clearly see the little polygons in black or blue are sort of home ranges of male and female tigers, and you see how they clustered around areas of higher ungulate density. So if we're able to reliably generate estimates for ungulate populations, and mind you, that's a massive exercise in itself. That gives you some clues, but still we don't have many answers. For example, you could have forests where there's a lot of prey. Take Western Rajaji, for example, or take Panna at a certain moment. The prey were adequate, but there were no tigers. In both of these areas, we know that poaching actually knocked tigers out. In Western Rajaji, we also know that in addition to poaching, the degradation of one or more vital corridors between the Corbett block and Western Rajaji, basically the two banks of the Ganga, and the expansion of Haridwar city and a lot of infrastructure, it effectively severed connectivity. Right, so it could be connectivity. In other areas, we know that people are still hostile to tigers. In Sariska, for example, there was a thought that tigers didn't persist because it's an area with a lot of livestock and cattle herding and so on. And perhaps the presence of a lot of tigers just wasn't favorable for people who were trying to eke out a livelihood somehow from the livestock, and they may have contributed to the tiger's decline. So these are just a few factors. In addition, we spoke about politics. We spoke to target tigers, essentially the behavior of people, their willingness or ability to sort of live with tigers or share space with tigers, the investment of governments, the interest of sort of civil society to participate in conservation processes, and at some levels also the delivery of good governance to people living around tigers. Right, so there's obviously a very high risk, potentially to human life and certainly to livestock. And if people are just sort of left to deal with these risks with no acknowledgement and little support for the cost that they bear, it's possible that one day they turn around and sort of aren't really a constituency of supporters for tiger conservation anymore. So it's all of this. It's a very layered puzzle, and there's many factors that I haven't spoken to. So bit by bit, if you start investigating these factors both within tiger habitats and in the surrounding landscape, you can start assembling this puzzle and use sort of techniques, technology, scientific methodology to try and figure out the relative contribution of these various factors, identify what's driving these patterns, and then figure out what sort of conservation or management measures one might use or prescribe to bring tigers back to an area to try and sort of stabilize tiger populations or otherwise enable the persistence of tigers in landscapes.
Yeah, no, I mean, what you've just said lets us know, most of us know now that it's not just poaching that is the bone of contention. It's a multitude layer of variables where you can have, the disconnectivity, like you've spoken of, the, lack of prey or too much prey, but the corridor is severed, like in Western Rajaji and in Panna, and the need to rewild certain areas in order to make sure that they can be alive again with, with the correct predator. So let's go on to the part that you're actually very involved with, and that is landscapes. And you are involved in landscape connectivity as well as the viability of each landscape across the country. So I would think that you have what, 4 to 5 landscapes that you look across through the country or more.
So at the moment, in India, there's six landscapes. So there's the Pranav landscape, which extends from the Yamuna River to Valmiki Tiger. There's the Sundarbans, which includes both protected and non-protected forests. The Brahmaputra plains, and now the landscape extends to the lower Arunachal hills as well. Central India, portions of Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, and Chhattisgarh. And then there's the Western Ghats. We primarily work in the southern Western Ghats, sort of at the border of Tamil Nadu and Kerala for the most part, not so much in Karnataka as an organization. And then Western India, western portions of Madhya Pradesh and adjacent areas in Rajasthan.
Okay, no, so that's 6 landscapes that you've highlighted. And now, so let's get an idea of, there's one question that has been brought up over the years when I've been discussing tigers with people, and it's the case of Thousand Islands versus a Garland. Thousand Island, as most of us are aware of, is a very tasty bit of mayonnaise, which is great to taste, but not great for the body. Whereas the Garland that we are talking about, that is basically a network of how your body should work in tandem with one another. So it allows the proper distribution channels to keep functioning and giving you the best of health. So may I ask, which is the area that you see which will thrive the most in terms of how many islands there are that can be connected? And is the protected area network that we currently have the best way going forward? That we want to make garlands, but we all look at only, oh no, let's make tiger reserves. But instead, do we look at tiger reserves versus community reserves versus, protected forests, yeah.
Right. So if you go back in India's history, and it depends on how far back you go, but there must have been a moment when all of India's tiger habitats would sort of physically have been connected. In that, if a tiger wanted to walk from the Tarai to Kanyakumari, potentially it would be able to do so through forested habitat. Right? There was, and obviously there would be various kinds of forests, but essentially there would be tree cover to varying extents, across an entire span. There'd be areas that would be arid. There'd be areas that would be, almost tropical. If you look at, India's forests today, they're highly fragmented. And as your analogy of sort of 1,000 islands speaks to the fact that a vast majority of, I think the average size of a protected area in India is about 250 or less than 300 square kilometers, right? That's about the home range of 3 adult male tigers. If you talk about viable tiger populations, they say, as a ballpark, that if there's about 25 breeding females in an area, it's likely that it will persist into the future. Right, so these small protected areas are certainly, for the most part, too small to have tiger numbers as large as that. So the fact is that because of human enterprise over time, the modification of forested landscapes into agrarian ones, then of course colonial machinery, colonial processes, the colonial love for game, the reduction of forests and so on, they've all taken a toll, and now we've ended up sort of with this complex geography where tiger populations for the most part are disjunct. In some cases, there's better connectivity perhaps in central India, for example, than in the Tarai, which is very linear. And I think this puts a lot of pressure on populations. Over time, the research has now established that populations that live in small isolated patches will, in sort of matter of time, become extinct, and that these processes will be accelerated by the building of roads and highways, by growing human settlements, and essentially by making the landscape impermeable to movement. So, regardless, I think protected areas, there's about 50 tiger reserves in the country. They've sort of served to sort of to preserve India's tiger populations, to give tigers an opportunity to bounce back. It's not like all these tiger reserves have thriving tiger populations today. I'd say about a third of them are doing really well. An equal number are sort of just hanging on, and there's others that sustain, very, very small tiger populations. So that suggests to me that, certainly this is one formula to take tiger conservation forward, but by no means does it guarantee success. On the other hand, if you look around, you look at landscapes, you find that areas that were not protected for much of sort of their modern history, their contemporary history, areas like Pilipit Tiger Reserve, which now has about 60 tigers, was managed for commercial forestry for almost 150 years. It still had higher tiger populations in surrounding protected areas. So the fact is that there are other conditions under which tiger populations can survive and even thrive. We don't fully know what these exceptions are, what sort of enables populations to do well in areas with high human use and so on, but we have some clues. So my answer to your question would be certainly, I think protected areas matter. Where possible, we should certainly strengthen these, look to create protected areas and so on. But we should also recognize that in the portfolio of sort of conservation areas that can sustain or support tiger conservation, there's a whole other variety of sort of options. These may include community conservation areas, they can include reserve forests, they can, in some cases, include the landscape and land use that's surrounding tiger reserves. For example, areas of agriculture, like sugarcane fields in Uttar Pradesh, which certainly support ungulates and the tigers that follow these sort of deer into farmlands or use these areas as corridors. So a much broader view of conservation, being narrowly focused on tiger reserves will not serve us well in the 21st century.
No, what you say now puts the highlight onto the fact that it's not enough to have a area which is just decked with ideal habitat resources, that is water, cover and prey, but dispersal aspect needs to be taken into account, so that if tigers cannot disperse, they will die out eventually because they get isolated, and an isolated population cannot really succeed beyond what.
Or we need to start playing God, which is we need to start moving tigers around in helicopters and by other means. And in some cases, maybe that's warranted. But if we really sort of envision a future for tigers in our country, where populations can't be sustained unless we need to intervene actively all the time, I think it'll just speak to a very free state for ecosystems. So hopefully, we have a future where animals are able to move around on their own, unassisted, other than by retaining land use that permits tiger movement.
I would say the other aspect that I wanted to come on to with the connectivity aspect is we have a large population that lives within, large population of people that lives within tiger reserves and in forests that are used by tigers, as that picture, as this picture of yours really demonstrates, right? That the people are working during the day.
To exemplify or state, this is the same location, right?
Exactly, same location.
And sometimes, this is of course some days apart. These images are time-stamped. But it's quite often that, including with ourselves or people, a tiger goes by, a minute later, 2 minutes later, 3 minutes later, people go by, right? And you can see these are people, they're not armed. They just, it's a family, it's children, it's women, it's a woman carrying a child. They're sort of moving through, through tiger country and essentially what might be considered hostile space. So on the one hand, of course, there's a fear of tigers. There's people who sort of know that there's a risk that they may be attacked by a tiger and so on, which is not a trivial risk. But there's also an understanding of people who sort of live their lives out in these areas, that the tiger, for the most part, is not an animal that's going to take sort of unprovoked, attack people, bring them down, and so on. So I'd say for the most part, human-tiger interactions are benign. For the most part, they go unseen. So for all the noise in the media of increasing conflict and so on and so forth, and that's not to trivialize that, because the loss of a tiger is something that's it's a huge tragedy. It certainly impacts families, impacts communities in sort of irreparable ways. So it's something that we need to sort of work on. We need to mitigate, but at the same time, it needs to be recognized that tigers have persisted in India today because, for the most part, these interactions remain benign.
Yeah, because that's what, otherwise, when you read in many hunter books, bullock cart like this, usually you wouldn't get too far because the tiger in the area would take one down. But that's not the case in a lot of areas anymore. It happens. It does happen. We are not going to, I think we'll keep that. It does happen. But for most part, like this photograph is taken in Tadoba, and this is in a very high tiger movement area, right? These guys are moving during the day. There's a lot of cover around, but they are moving through. They are like you said, their understanding of their space alongside the tiger's space is very prevalent because of the culture with which they've grown up with. They've grown up with tigers, so they understand that, okay, there will be a certain level of conflict, but we can manage it. We don't like tigers, but we don't want them to go away either, because there's something revered about the tiger as well. So I think that puts that coexistence aspect more easily, right? As compared to a lot of countries which are economically very powerful, but have lost a lot of their main predators and have had to rewild them fully.
Right. So the mechanisms of coexistence are quite complex, right? Go back to the previous image and now come back to this one. So one mechanism is right in front of you here, right? You see people, they're walking by and you see the tiger moving at night, right? There's recognition here that after dark, right, and then be those hours of the dawn or after dusk, the forest belongs to the tiger. Right? So people will make haste to leave the forest when it's getting dark. In other areas where there aren't as many people, you'll find tigers sort of moving around in front of camera traps in the day a lot more. Here, sort of, there's an understanding among people that yes, there's tigers, they're going to be active after dark. Let's not be here. The tigers have made their peace with the fact that their forests are infiltrated, so to speak, by people through the day. So they hunker down and they lie low in areas where they can't be seen by human eyes. And then come twilight, they start moving around. So that's one mechanism that sort of enabled co-adaptation and potentially coexistence. There's others. So if you go to the next image, so sort of as scientists, you said that these people are cognizant that there's a risk to their lives. They're also cognizant that the risk is probably quite small. Right now, imagine instead of a bullock cart with 4 or 5 people, that this was one lone person walking through the same forest. That risk, right? If it is a woman who was crouching and cutting grass, that risk may be even higher. And if she was alone, right? So there is a risk, and as sort of scientists, we try and understand this risk. We try and as a probability. What's the likelihood of a person, a village, an area? How are people there to risk? And then what sort of measures? The other aspect that you spoke to is certainly critically important as well. Why is it that despite this, why is it that people still choose to sort of accommodate tigers in their midst, to share space with tigers? And this really is one of the most remarkable aspects of tiger conservation in India. Is not to say that such attitudes or behaviors are not found elsewhere, but I think given we spoke to the high human densities in India, the fact that there's more pressure on our forests and land than there's almost in any other place on the planet, and the fact that we still sustain tigers, I think really the burden of that, the credit for that goes as much, if not more, to communities sharing space with tigers. And as you said, it's not because they necessarily love the tiger on every occasion. It's just a certain recognition that this is a living being that also belongs. It's a being that's been around here as long as we have, and potentially a lot longer. And at some level, there's little to be gained from killing this animal. So let's try and find a way of getting by as long as we can, as far as we can. That's not to say that people don't kill tigers in India. It happens quite a lot. There are areas of India where the tiger is sort of extinct. There's areas of India where the tiger is in deep trouble. So one can't paint this with a broad brush. Generalizations are, but nonetheless, studying sort of these aspects of behavior, aspects of culture that have enabled coexistence at whatever level holds the key to tiger conservation in India and elsewhere moving forward.
So on this note as well, I want to take a segue on a point you had made when we had interacted some time ago, where it was basically a comparison between an inviolate area and a community forest, where the Gujar aspect was there. And you had found through your research something very extraordinary in a Gujar forest versus an inviolate area in comparison. Can you just let us know that part? Because I think most of us are under the impression inviolate is the be all and end all.
Right. Inviolate certainly has a lot going for it. I don't necessarily hold it as a gold standard in every case. I think the example you're speaking to, the areas of the Tarai, the Gujars, for people who don't know, are a pastoralist, nomadic buffalo herding community. And there has been research that has documented how the exit of from national parks like Ranchi tigers are bounced back. Right. So it's certainly been documented that when the pressures went down, tiger populations went up. Right. There's other areas of the Tarai. If you look at Amangarh Tiger Reserve, or you look at Ramnagar Forest Division, these are areas that still have sort of large, very substantial Gujar populations within them. They also sustain some of the highest tiger densities in India, right? And I think that speaks to the point that areas that have high human use, under some circumstances, can still sustain tigers, right? And that's not to say that all is well, because it's possible that these Gujars face many risks. Their buffaloes are getting killed. They may or may not be compensated time for this. We also don't fully understand the dynamics in such areas, right? It's possible that the dynamics are very unstable because if Gujars are at risk, tigers may also be at risk. Risk of poisoning, risk of mortality from other forms. So certainly in human sort of dominated and disturbed areas, the dynamics will be more complex. The interactions will be more fraught. But and I think not just the Gujars. If you look at you look at Pilibhit, you look at Satyamangalam, you look at 24 Parganas in the Sundarbans. These are just some examples of areas. Or you look at the BRT hills. Like these are areas where humans continue to use forests in very large numbers, and we still have sort of tigers to be. I think understanding the conditions under which tigers persist, survive, thrive in areas with high human use can give us a lot of clues about what sort of options we have for conserving tigers in areas that can't necessarily be protected as inviolate spaces, because those options only exist in some areas and cannot necessarily be replicated everywhere.
Correct. Yeah, that's why I brought that note up, because I think I was more taken aback anyway, how even after having spent that much time reading about various aspects of wildlife and conservation, that a Gujar dominated forest could contribute so much because of the way they lop their wood and how it allows certain vegetation to grow, that it actually favors the herbivore densities to grow higher. And I think you also highlighted that one of the key aspects in a population of carnivores thriving in an area is tolerance. It's not enough that we have a lot of things in the economy growing for us, but tolerance is a major aspect in it. And the other side of it, and that is in spite of this, when you have conflict like this, like you've highlighted in Pilibhit, where man-animal conflict is very real. It is scary. It is not something that a city person can ever understand unless I say, okay, let me put, a pack of stray dogs outside that will constantly threaten you, and then you'll know what it feels like magnified by 1,000, and that is what a person in the village faces when they go out. So with this tolerance, do you think that it's possible for a populous country like India to still make it happen? Is it tolerance? Is tolerance the key? Or do we need something else? Do we need a little more support?
I think tolerance is the key. But if it's assumed that there's tolerance because we sort of leave it to people to support the national animal, but we don't necessarily support these people. Many of them are marginalized, disadvantaged, living in among the poorest districts of the country. If it's their burden to carry, to sort of for tigers to persist in India, I think we've lost the plot, and I think there's great injustice there, right? So I think good governance, ensuring that people living in and around tiger habitats are supported in so many ways. They may be enabled by sort of empowering them to manage these forests to whatever extent where this is permitted by law. They may be enabled by compensating them for their losses. They may be enabled, for example, by through programs that bring education, that bring development that they aspire for. In some cases, there could be roads. In some cases, it could be houses and lights. Where this is sort of permissible, certainly, we need to recognize that their needs and aspirations are every bit, as significant as legitimate as ours. So I think tolerance shouldn't be a given. It certainly shouldn't be expected, but it can be enabled and fostered. And really, it's upon all of us and upon the government to sort of, create those conditions. Beyond that, obviously, tigers need protection. There are species that are poached. There's a global sort of trade chain that's driving poaching to a large part. The risk of habitat fragmentation from expansion of highways. India has one of the highest rates of road building and road expansion in the world. They pose threats that will be impossible to mitigate in the future. An opportunity now for connectivity conservation will be an option that's off the table in 5 or 10 years from now. So if we don't sort of raise our voice now, if we don't act now, we'll have fewer and fewer options, and we'll see populations getting fragmented, isolated, and possibly out one by one.
No, I think there's no doubt that the time is now. We don't have a tomorrow that we can keep waiting on. The way we are moving and living, we don't really have that. So going on that, I'm going to ask you to give us an idea of how can the normal layperson or public contribute in their own way in order to save the wilderness in which the tiger exists, so that the tiger can exist within it.
Right. There's, again, I think a hard question, and it has a multi-part answer. So I think, the first is to recognize that tigers live in these vast landscapes. These vast landscapes have sort of, functional ecosystems within them. Ecosystem function is supported by complex processes, right? Which or certain complex processes need to be upheld for ecosystems to be functional. For those processes to be upheld, for example, you need corridors that are functional. You need animals to be able to move from one area to another, to compensate for losses in one area. You need gene flow to be maintained and so on. So as a common citizen, all of this seems very remote. It seems very disconnected from our lives, right? So I think one of the ways in which we can contribute is to raise issues that matter, right? Remember, tigers and other wildlife aren't a political constitution. They can't speak for themselves. If anybody has a voice for them, it's us, right? So how we make our voice heard, whether it's by contributing to media, whether it's participating in campaigns, whether it's sort of demanding and participating in democratic processes that uphold environmental values. I think these are all significant ways. Beyond that, we know that we live in a global village now. So tigers don't just have to be sustained in India. Tigers need to be sustained globally. Wildlife and biodiversity needs to be sustained globally. The choices we make as consumers, if it's consuming products with palm oil, for example, that may be contributing to the loss of orangutan or tiger habitat in the tropics. Palm oil may soon come to India in a big way. It could be contributing to the loss of tiger habitat in Northeast India. So not just in products, but also so essentially being cognizant of our footprint. It's not always obvious to us how that footprint sort of manifests itself around the globe. That's another way of participating. And the third is sort of tourists traveling to areas, motivated to see a tiger and so on. When we travel to areas, being cognizant that our travel has sort of environmental impact. Obviously, an emission of gases and things which in one way or other can impact wildlife habitats. And then beyond that, again, if we choose to travel and live in ultra luxurious resorts that have a huge environmental footprint, that don't necessarily sort of distribute benefits back to people living around tiger habitat, sharing space with tigers. These models of tourism are perhaps not sustainable and not in the interest of tiger conservation. So also making wise choices as tourists. So these are just some examples of how you and I can sort of in our choices and decisions and day-to-day lives, perhaps contribute in small ways of being. And the fourth, of course, would be if you want to get involved. There's a lot of organizations, initiatives around India, around the world that are sort of, there's devoted people, there's people contributing to these efforts. So sort of, it doesn't necessarily mean monetary contribution. It could mean contributing time. It could mean amplifying the messaging that's sort of coming out from the organizations or joining campaigns, but essentially getting the word out. And becoming a champion in whichever way for a cause. If that cause be the tiger, well and good. If it's another cause for the environment, that's equally important.
No, so I totally agree. I mean, most people when they think of the last part where you said, they can always contribute in different other ways. That they always think, oh no, that means I have to give money to all those people who don't have money. But no, it's basically like you stated, becoming more aware of the realities and understanding the facts that change or stagnate an equation. So the change equation, like in this picture, you can have irresponsible tourism versus fantastic tourism, where you can have forest rest houses, which are, pristine versus, too many resorts that clumber around one area and basically have no ceiling, and so the whole visitor experience basically goes for a toss. And of course there is a certain level of disturbance to the animal, but I think we've seen that the animal can choose to move off should it feel okay, today I'm not in the mood. So I would definitely like to end on that note, Pranav, so that we can invite questions and answers from the audience, because I think they have a lot of information which they'll probably need to sift through over the next few minutes. And I'm going to put forth one question that has been sent to me via WhatsApp, and that is, it's a biological question. It's a biology question. As the size of a species increases, its lifespan also goes up accordingly. Then how is it that the lifespan of the tiger is only 10 to 15 years?
Well, I think clearly that means that the relationship doesn't hold true. There are exceptions.
Yeah. So basically you're saying that when it comes to a carnivorous animal, not just a carnivorous, it faces a number of other factors which will make sure that the that lifespan will not go beyond that point.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the relationship with body size is really well established in the ecological literature. For example, macaws, parrots, tortoises, they're not gigantic animals, but they're certainly long-lived, right? So I think there may certainly be some large-bodied animals including humans, if we count, if we sort of consider ourselves to be large-bodied. Elephants have very long lives, but they're certainly large-bodied animals that have very short lives. There are small animals that can live very long lives. So I don't think that's a relationship in ecology and biology that sort of there's certainly a lot of noise around it.
I would invite other Q&As. I'm going to read. How to engage in sustainable tourism around tiger habitats is by anonymous.
All right, that's a really good question. I think the word sustainability is unfortunately sort of bandied about very loosely for the most part. Ecotourism is a term that is often, misused. So I think if you were looking, if you wanted to be a responsible tourist, you'd look for places that were actually run and managed by communities. You try and do some research and see if if it's actually run by a community institution rather than an individual. So the funds are not just flowing back to one person who then becomes sort of the wealthiest person in a community, but instead helps carry the whole community along through sort of some mechanism that can then be put back to improve the quality of lives of all of these people. So I think that would be ideal. In addition, of course, you could look at other practices. For example, are they managing their waste responsibly? Are they adhering to sort of prescribed rules and norms in terms of tourism hours, tourism zones? Are they sourcing the food that they serve locally, or is it food that's being flown from across the world to cater to sort of needs and tastes and desires? So I think obviously the smaller scale, the more low key, the more likely that it is sustainable, and the more the sort of comfortable, luxurious, and hyped, the less likely so. There could be exceptions, but I think in general one could follow this principle.
Fantastic. Can you give certain examples of these? I mean, I know Pavalgarh comes to mind when we talk about a community which has involved itself in ecotourism. I think, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong. Pavalgarh is what comes to my mind when I think about that. Kyari.
I think that's a reasonable example. And I also think that, the forest department actually got its act together and helped the community form institutions for tourism. So that certainly stands out. And I think across India, there are homestays that have cropped up. And now there's also resorts that call themselves homestays. So I think some areas around Periyar and Munnar and those parts, there have been some good examples of ecotourism. And I think if you looked hard, you'd find small-scale sustainable tourism here and everywhere. But one would have to be a discerning tourist, and you have to have your eyes open and make sure that if you're looking for that, then it really is that.
Yeah, no, so the discerning, the awareness part that we discussed just before we ended, where I think another example that I suddenly thought of was Umred Karandla in eastern Maharashtra. Gothangaon, Umred Karandla, that area, and in that Satpura Pench landscape where they do conduct a certain amount.
Yes, I mean, you've traveled more to some of these areas than I have, so you probably have good examples. But I know from Arunachal, I know the same example, and I also know that maintaining sort of sustainable tourism and infrastructure at the community level is hard. It needs a lot of handholding. Some communities can't always self-mobilize. They need to be supported. They need to be financed. So there have been good examples, but they've collapsed after a few years when people supporting them sort of pulled out. So it's work in progress in many areas.
I would, on this account, also invite Mr. Habibullah to speak, since he has a question.
Please unmute yourself, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, we can.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I'm so sorry I got very late and my machine was letting me down, so I didn't hear half the talk. But I'd like your opinion about a decision that I made some time ago, in which there was a big dispute which happened. I happened to be Secretary Panchayati Raj at that time, and I had an important role in actually drafting the Forest Rights Act, which you would have, of course, heard of. But now I'll tell you why I'm asking this question, because my research and my studies had showed that the indigenous tribal populations, traditionally, as you know, before the British took over the forests and declared them all government property, these forests were the private ownership of the tribal community. And the tribal community, the residents of the tribal community, had helped conserve particularly tigers and carnivores over the centuries because their economy was interdependent. The minor forest produce, the conservation of animals, and so on. In our present times, and I think you mentioned this, because of the onset of large populations into the forests, there has been an encroachment on so far as the animal rights are concerned. But with the Forest Rights Act, which, as you know, after a long time has given rights of ownership to tribals and long-term residents of the forest. And, you know, for a long time, the government had been updating that, and people who come in up to a certain time were declared they could be owners of the property and so on. This had laid down a wider circumstance for that. On the basis of the principle, what I had worked on was the basic principle that the local population were the best conservator of forests, better than, in fact, the forest guards. And, in fact, seen in the context of Project Tiger, which also had something. But my colleague in the Environment Ministry felt that this law was actually going to endanger tigers, particularly tigers. And that is why I'm asking you this question. What would your opinion be about the effects of the Forest Rights Act in helping to conserve the tiger population?
That's a really good question, and not one I was expecting on this forum, but I'm glad it's come up. Right, it's one of the most contentious themes in conservation in India today at so many levels. It's not a question that has any direct or easy answers. I'll try and take it as best as I can. Right. So I think we need to move away from simple premises at either end here. Right. I think saying that the Forest Department alone can ensure the tiger's future, or that tribal communities alone are equipped to ensure the tiger's future, are both inadequate. And I'll give you examples at both ends, right? So if you look at Southeast Asia, looking beyond India, we know that a lot of tiger habitats there are still inhabited by indigenous communities that have been there for the longest time. If you look at large parts of India, Eastern India, Chhattisgarh, parts of Maharashtra, parts of Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Northeast India, these are areas where India's tiger population is severely depleted. There are also areas that have large tiger populations. Right? I'm not implying here that the one has led to the other. The depletion of tigers is somehow directly connected to the presence of tribal communities and so on. Because in addition to them being there, we also know that the administrator of these forests are ultimately the Forest Department. Right? Now, when it comes to the implementation of the Forest Rights Act, I think the evidence of whether communities in all cases are able to effectively govern and manage their resources to conserve forests and tigers at levels that can help sustain populations, that evidence is largely lacking. That data hasn't been collected for the most part. So the areas to communities have been small. The process of actually granting community forest rights or individual rights is work in progress in many areas. It's mired in confusion in many areas. So I think the act hasn't really been implemented in spirit. So I think in the absence of data, it's really hard to know for certain it will work. However, organization, certainly at WWF India, we believe that conferring these rights to people who are so entitled is the way forward. We certainly remain optimistic that this is a valid means of promoting the goals of tiger conservation, and that we can succeed if it's done in spirit and if it's supported by institutions and organizations that enable the act to be fully implemented as it has been written and envisioned. And it's wonderful that you've contributed to an act as important as this. And so in a nutshell, I think there's huge potential. We really don't have the answers of how well it's worked so far.
Well, thank you. That really answered my question, because you have said that in spirit, That is actually the way to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vajal sir. I mean, that really did put a highlight into the entire conversation as well, because the Forest Rights Act, as Pranav said, as you and Pranav have both stated, is so contentious. And I wish we had more time. I knew that when we got into this talk, we would always be out of time. We've probably covered a fraction and a summary of what we've actually had chalked out. So hopefully another time we can get back to Pranav and pick his brains on the entirety of tiger conservation. On that note, I will, if there are other questions, I can always, I would request you to please send them to our conveners so that we can pass them on to Pranav and he can write you an email.
I've texted some to you, Samir, just have a look.
Yeah, okay. So I think, no, I've asked one and I can see one more, which is about starting a syllabus on wildlife conservation in schools, especially in high density habitats. Now, I don't know what high density habitat is in terms of people, or is it in terms of wildlife? So, but thoughts about starting a syllabus on wildlife conservation in schools. But like I said, since we are short of time, I would request Pranav to send the answer, and we can put it on a board which the anonymous attendee can look at. And with that, I would request the DSOP Secretariat to please give a closing note. And yeah, we take it from there.
I think a very, very enlightening talk on one of the most beautiful, powerful, large, not easily visible species of cats, and how endangered such a large and powerful animal is. And talk happens on World Environment Day, which is another coincidence. Yeah, I think one of the most beautiful things Pranav started with was that he learned about nature from nature by being around nature. I mean, that's such a beautiful thing. I mean, you can't be taught this in a book. You have to learn by being with nature. It's wonderful. And yes, we are the most populous nation in the world. We've overtaken China in numbers, but don't forget that we have only 1/3 of their territory size. So the density of population is so much higher out here. But thank you all, Pranav, Samir, of course, Kavita, for all the work that you and team have done, and to all our participants. Thank you so much for attending. We will upload this talk on our YouTube channel for people to see or go through again or record or send to friends. Right? Do stay with us for our next event.
Thank you very much, Pranav, Samir, and Ashu, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
to Pranav. I mean, I always get enlightened whenever I'm just hearing him. So, and thank you, Kavita and Sir.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all.